Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I'm your host, Harmony. And today,
Harmony Slater.
yes, today I'm here with, as you heard, Russell Case.
I think, do you normally say Harmony Slater?
I don't know.
Harmony, I came across a stat the other day that I thought you'd be interested in.
Really?
And possibly intrigued by, especially given the guest that we have today.
Okay.
I heard that children of single mothers behave quite differently as adults than children of a dual parent home.
How so?
So sons of single moms as adults participate in the cleaning duties much more statistically significantly than boys with dual parents.
Huh.
And girls are much more likely to have careers if they're raised with a single mom.
sense.
It does make sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the painful irony is that I'm helping to raise Jediah.
Yes.
With like this mindset, like he should be cleaning, he should be, making his bed, doing the dishes, doing all these things.
Yeah.
But he's being raised in a dual parent home, and he's crippled by it.
No, he's enhanced by it.
No, I just feel like he should be cleaning more. But
the moral of this story.
The other thing that I thought was really...
Which of you is moving out?
Yeah, right? Which of us is moving out? Good question.
Yeah. If anything, I'll just move downstairs. The other, I think, interesting thing, and this is probably just more anecdotal in my own experience, is that I also feel like being raised as a single mom myself, as you know, and many of our listeners know, I was raised by my mother.
Yeah, raised by your single mom. Yeah.
Yeah, raised in quotations. I heard that. So, raised by my single mom is that I feel like I was much more comfortable with the emotional fluctuation that comes with having a female roommate.
Yeah.
And so that's made it, I think, much easier, I think, for me just to also, ride the waves of your emotional fluctuation.
Oh,
I feel like it's like surfing, like a giant red tide.
It's important to learn how to surf those red tides. That's kind of what we're here to talk about today.
Is it really?
Kind of, yeah. Like our guest today, very special guest, is a cycle syncing coach.
A cycle syncing coach?
Yeah. Briana Villegas. Did I say it right?
Villegas.
Thank you. I knew I was going to get it wrong.
Briana Villegas.
And tell us, oh my goodness, what is a cycle syncing coach?
Yeah, so obviously it's a term that is not, super common, but hopefully it's going to become more and more common. And the idea is really understanding how to work with the menstrual cycle, and that the menstrual cycle is more than the 3 to 7 days that you're on your period every month, but the way that our hormones fluctuate affect the way that we show up in the world, the things that we notice, we perceive, our motivation, energy, everything about who we are is also fluctuating across the whole month. And when we are ignoring that, we tend to have more symptoms, but we also get into patterns where we feel like we're fighting ourselves more and leaning more into that like hustle culture. Because so much of the patterns of society and what we're told we should do and the pace we should do it at are not aligned with that female rhythm. And so understanding how it works allows you to then, adjust the way that you move about in the world and the way you show up so that it is more aligned and things get so much easier.
I see. We love this topic. Well, I love it because you love it too?
Well, no, it reminds, my mother told me this early on when I was kind of trying to figure out what the fuck was going on, she said, look, I feel a little weird like the week before my period, Russell. I feel pretty weird the week after my period. I feel weird during my period. So there's like 2 days where I feel good. Okay. I said, yes, mommy.
I think you had a kind of a similar experience to your teenage years, Briana. Is that what brought you into this work?
Yeah, definitely my own experience got me on the path. So I, from my first period, had very extreme symptoms, mostly like emotional cognitive symptoms, also cramps and everything, but in relation, they didn't seem as bad. And for me, it was 2 weeks out of the month were just anxious, depressed, brain fog, intrusive thoughts. I kind of refer to them as like suicidal adjacent thoughts. Many women with what I later learned, 13 years later, learned was called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and not actually the normal, experience of having a menstrual cycle. And many women do experience suicidal ideation. Many women, unfortunately, take their lives as a result of just having this experience month after month after month and not having any real answers. And so when I discovered that this was a thing, there was definitely some relief in having a label and being like, okay, I'm not just unable to cope with this very normal process compared to my peers, but was also disheartened by what the medical community was providing in terms of answers. At the time, it was going on the pill, which I had done that. That was not a solution for me. Antidepressants or a hysterectomy or medically induced menopause were the options. And at the time I was 23, so I knew going down the route of menopause or anything like that was, especially in the US, like that was going to be a non-starter conversation. And wasn't worth the fight or effort to do that, at least for me. And so I went this other route where I'm like, I've been to grad school. I've been taught how to research. Like I know how to find answers. And so I just went digging until I came across this information, which was ultimately like the basics. Like this is how the female body works. And it, just changed so much of how not only I was going about the way that I lived, but just my understanding and grace that I had with myself as well. And restating like, what is normal? What am I even trying to attain? Because my goal was my super consistent, optimistic, super high energy husband who's the same like clockwork every single day. And understanding that that's not even what I should be striving for, because that's not, the pattern that I'm on.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Like having like really transforming and changing what our expectations of what an ideal is.
Yeah. And I like that. I mean, because it's a real thing, I think sometimes, as women, it's sort of like looked upon as maybe a weakness or a defect or something's wrong with you. And especially like as a teenager, you're not educated on it. Nobody's talking about it. They're just like, oh, it's your time of the month. You have PMS. Like, it's sort of like a joke, but it's like a real thing that affects us, and it's not a defect, and it's not a weakness. It can be used as a strength for us, I think, and so that's something that's kind of interesting.
Well, certainly you're much more highly skilled at understanding emotional variability than a male.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So tell me what do you do? Like what kind of clients come to you and what do you do with them?
Yeah. So right now, most of the time, people that are coming to me do have some sort of struggle with hormone imbalances or disorders. So things like PCOS, PMDD, and they're really looking for answers. So that's who I'm working with right now. And I feel very, connected to that community as well. Like I've been there and I know that struggle of I'm watching this affect my relationships in my life. And that's, not something that I'm okay with. I'm not okay living this way. But at the same time, I also started this practice and wanting to bring this more into the level of like, how do we optimize the way we're living as well, not just from a healing perspective, because I also know there's so many women going about their day where it's like, okay, I PMS for a few days and, I'm cramping for a few days. And it's not at that level where they're really questioning, is this normal? Because for me, it was like my symptoms were so bad. The impact on, my ability to show up at work, in my relationship with my husband, as a mom, like all of those things were so impacted before I was even like, this can't be normal. And wanting to shift this, that those symptoms, those things that seem like a weakness because we seem erratic or hormonal or emotional or, dealing with actual pain, debilitating pain, those look like weaknesses because it's our body telling us something's wrong and not telling us that this is just, you're a woman, so this is life. But that's the way that we've been taught to perceive all of those symptoms.
Yeah.
And so even that shift, that these are all signs that we need to look deeper and we can do something about this. Even the fact that the menstrual cycle is considered a vital sign.
Yeah.
Well, that's a shift in terminology, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that when you see issues in your menstrual cycle, this is that almost like first line sign that there's issues going on deeper, because these hormones interact with every other system in your body, your metabolism, the way your neural pathways are set up, your digestion, your gut, like all of these things are interrelated. And so understanding that there's a connection there, and not just like, okay, I'll just take the ibuprofen, or I'll just, suppress or take the pill to suppress those things. And really in taking the pill, it's almost like striving for neutral, and learning that that's not the goal either.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like your body's trying to tell you something with all of these different signs and symptoms that you're experiencing. I know I always felt like, I'd be more irritated about things, like little things. And I always felt like it was like my true feelings about things were coming to the surface, like, and
That's
so
100%
it always
what happens.
Yeah. It's like,
100%,
I
yeah.
really am, super irritated about this thing. Like it's, like, I just can't let this go. But like during the rest of the month, I'm sort of like, oh, whatever, just like pushing it down, not thinking about it. But like at that time, it like comes up like,
gnarly.
Yeah.
And what happens there is all your hormones, like when you're on your period, are at their lowest. And what actually happens in the brain is the connection between the two hemispheres is strongest. So you're actually more in tune and more sensitive to essentially what your needs are. And of course, how everyone around you is crossing those boundaries that you either have or don't have and need to put in place. And so there is this heightened sensitivity to what my individual needs are. And then the week after, estrogen goes up, serotonin goes up, and it acts as kind of a hormonal amnesia where you're like, okay, everything's fine. Like glass half full, like. And so that's such a powerful time to like journal and be really like intentional with like, what are the things that are bothering me? And are these a pattern that are coming back every month? Because that's an insight into like, these are things that need to be conversations, not necessarily that week when you're heightened and more reactive, but this is something to come back to and is something that needs to shift, as opposed to being dismissed as PMSing or being hormonal or dramatic, because it feels so, reactive.
Oh, I love that. That's so interesting. In this Ashtanga yoga practice, in the sort of tradition of Ashtanga yoga that a lot of our listeners practice in, women are always prescribed to take at least 3 days of their menstrual cycle. So maybe the first 3 days or the second, third, fourth day, whichever days are the heaviest, to rest and like not do their physical asana practice, but to, they can maybe do some meditation or
I think you're
journaling.
Just supposed to go into the hut in the backyard.
I mean, it's based on a very ancient, maybe slightly superstitious Indian tradition where women at that time, we didn't have sanitary napkins or tampons or things like that. So women would go into a separate area of the house and like kind of were considered, I'm going to say not clean, and I'm probably going to get a lot of comments from people saying that's not correct. But anyway, they're considered like they needed to be separate, sort of like the red tent situation, right? But rather than all the women congregating together, they get put in their own little place.
What Patabi Joyce's wife would say is like, no. Look, I needed to get away from these people. and it was for me to get away from them. That's what this is about.
I mean, there is a little bit of that where the women don't have to do the chores or make food or do any of their, regular duties or responsibilities. They get to just kind of like chill out by themselves for 3 days. But from like a Western perspective where, we're in this culture, maybe a hustle culture, we're like trying to like be equal to men or the same. It seems quite sexist and anti-feminist in a way. To tell a woman like, oh, you need to just like go there and relax, right? Because as a woman, I'm always like, well, I think I know my body. I think I know what I need better than you do as a man who has no fucking idea what it's like to be a woman. So that's always like my approach, but I'm curious. I love this idea of like journaling and like writing down like what's really coming up for you at that time and making that sort of like a sacred practice during your cycle. But what do you think about all this? What do you think about this ancient tradition and like modern times and like bringing the two together?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super interesting conversation because there's obviously the sort of societal norms of like being unclean and seeing it as something to be separate, which is not things that I would recommend we bring with us, into into our current time. Yeah. And like, it's not dirty. It's not unclean. Like none of those things are true. But at the same time, you can see how there are some things lost in not taking advantage of having a culture that respects this time in some way to protect it. But really, when I get into this with people, it comes down very to personalization in this, because I think a lot of times what you need and how many days you need or what that structure looks like of creating space for yourself depends a lot on what your current experience is. If you have endometriosis and you have debilitating cramps and pain, like you should in no way feel bad about blocking off, a day at a time, days at a time to really care for yourself. If you, are struggling with PMS and you're just like really triggered, asking for space away from your partner, from your kids, something like that can also be it's more for you. It's for everyone, right? Like that's going to help you not be triggered and kind of be able to tune into what your needs are in that moment. But then also it protects those relationships in some ways as well, because it's not like you're doing any good in those situations anyway. And so creating that space can be really, really helpful. But I think when it comes to movement, that again is like what feels good. And I think for so long around periods, the conversation has been kind of prescriptive of what you should do, what you can and can't do. So like you can't play in sports because you're bleeding, or you can't do these things. So there's this natural like inclination to be like, well, watch me. Which is great. And, there's marathon runners that free bleed and, all of these things, which are, like you do you.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Do you.
I was swallowing right when you said that.
So it's just like what the body is capable of doing is incredible. But, it comes back down to like what feels good. So if you go in to do your yoga practice and you're just not feeling it strength wise or whatever, like being willing to negotiate and modify, being willing to say, you know what, I'm just gonna, lay here and do breathing and just let it be a meditative practice instead of heavy on the movement. But there's also athletes that will get PRs on their period. So it's really like where you feel your best. Yeah. So they're like personal
record.
best.
Oh,
personal
records.
records.
Yeah. Okay.
Because what's happening kind of biologically is once your period starts, you have this window, this week to week and a half, where your body is like not doing anything for the reproductive process. You're not preparing to ovulate. You're not, preparing the uterus in case you're pregnant or doing that process. And so it's really where all of your energy can go towards these physical activities and this outward push. But if your cycle is not healthy and you're struggling with symptoms, that's just a sign that your body needs more care. And so slowing down in that process is what's going to get you back to being able to use more of those days for, output, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think one of the most phenomenal things I've learned in our Ashtanga culture is this notion that a woman should not do the closing sequence, which we do in
Oh
Ashtanga
yeah,
yoga,
that's
of the
interesting.
headstand and the shoulder stand.
Like inversions, like
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because
it interferes with like or disrupts the like downward movement or that downward flow of the cycle when you spend, a longer period of time in an inverted position.
and also just like the notion of bandha, of like holding and withdrawing in
Yeah.
the pelvic floor when that should be released to allow energy to come downward. And I think there's a lot that we can talk about there, or I can listen. But also, I think what's also phenomenal about it is the kind of understanding that a woman's cycle is going to be public in the Mysore room. And some women are going to go and put their feet up against the wall rather than doing inversions. And everyone else just has to fucking be okay with it.
Yeah.
And I just really have always really admired that and liked it, that as a male yoga teacher, it's expectation in the Mysore culture of Ashtanga yoga to facilitate that space. And I think it's unusual.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that so much of it is we're kind of taught to hide it from, hiding even the commercials, right? Where you have the tampon hidden in your sleeve to like pass off to your friend, like, or, in schools feeling like you have to raise your hand and like announce to your class because you're taking your bag to the bathroom with you. And there's so much shame around it versus seeing this as like, this is such a human experience and creating space for that and allowing it to be, and understanding that what's needed for women is going to be different at different times of the month. But really, this is like a mirror of the circadian rhythm. So men have these hormone patterns as well, but they align more to that 24-hour day clock, right? Where testosterone's highest in the morning. So they get up, they go running, they do their workouts, and they can do it without eating first. And they get all of these gains, and it's amazing. But then later after lunchtime, that sort of happy hour window, their estrogen's higher. So they want to be more social. It's a better time for meetings. It's a better time for them to be engaging socially. And then, you think about the after work, like the beer and sports or whatever image, is like that rest and relaxation. So they're having these same patterns. It's just happening in the day.
That's so phenomenal. I've never heard that laid out like that before. That is 100% my life. Jesus Christ. I'm overwhelmed right now.
And that's what happens when I explain the cycle phases to women. They're like, oh, it all makes sense.
Right. And I mean, that's even fascinating. Like when I think of our yoga practice, because it is kind of set up that way a little bit where, people wake up really early and they're supposed to practice before they eat, on the empty stomach. It's the optimum time to do that. In the tradition. And so then you do that and you go quite a while without eating. And then like you're supposed to work during the day afterwards somehow after doing a really intense practice. And then like sleep 6 hours a night, basically, and I think as women, we have so many more responsibilities, like making food, getting our kids' lunches ready, making dinners, putting kids to bed. Like, sometimes as a woman, you're not getting to bed till like 10 or 11 at night. I feel like it's a little bit,
it's a drag.
Yeah, no, but it's like counterproductive to wake up before 5 a.m. in the morning if you're not getting to bed until 11. And even that feels like it's not a great time. I mean, I monitor my sleep and I always get my best sleep between like 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. It's like such a like sweet sleep window for me. So it's
and knowing that, it's like, why would you disrupt that when you know that's your best sleep and you know how important sleep is to everything else in your day and your body functioning. Yeah. And so kind of the parallel there is the week after your period is when energy's highest, appetite is lower, because again, your body's doing less work. Because I think a lot of times we look at externally, like the kids and the cooking and kind of life tasks as like, is my day busy or not? But we don't consider the internal process as well, because at certain times of the month, our body's doing so much more work. After ovulation, your body's like doing an addition to the uterus, right? It's adding on. And that process burns up to like 280 more calories a day. That's just baseline, like sitting on the couch. That's how much more work your body's doing. And we don't factor that in. So when you're trying to do the same intensity of your workout or keep up the same pace or level of activity in your day without adding in additional food, trying to restrict sleep, those sorts of things, it's just not actually fueling the work that your body's doing. And other, like men wouldn't do that. If you do an extra workout in your day, like you're going to eat another snack, you're going to have a protein shake, or you're going to add something, because obviously you burn more calories, you need more fuel,
100%.
or you don't build muscle. Like there's no point of doing the things that you did.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I always felt like that, actually. Like personally, the week before my period was always like the time when I really wanted to rest and like not do my practice, or like I was like, this is when I need to take days off. And then when my period happened, it was like such a relief. It was such a like release of like tension and pressure and like everything, and I felt like I had energy and I felt really good. So it's interesting that like you're talking about that building up of the uterus wall and how much energy that's actually taking.
I've had a couple of students tell me that they just said privately, I would really prefer to take the time off before my period, not during my period. It's like, you do whatever you need.
You do you.
It's not. There's no sutra that I can use to help you through this.
Yeah, and that's where it comes, like a lot of the protection around the menstrual phase of when you're actually bleeding is because so many women experience cramps and pain and discomfort. And so then it's like, if you're feeling that, like you shouldn't be pushing yourself as hard. You should allow your body to rest. But when things are healthy and like what's normal experience for a period, it is some maybe slight tension, maybe some slight heaviness, maybe slight cramping, but like it's almost like an awareness that something's happening. Then I'm in pain, or I need to do any sort of extreme disruption to my day. It's more of like an invitation to slow down, because your body's doing this work. But really, once that's in that healthy range, it is when you start to hit the ability, you get that energy back. And that week before is where you're doing more of the work. So that is when to kind of factor that in energy-wise.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do you think about like this going upside down? Do you think that's going to affect or disrupt the cycle?
I don't think it disrupts the cycle. And again, I guess I'm not as familiar with the practice. I don't know how long you're spending inverted.
Maybe a couple minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah. And with a lot of those things, especially people who have practiced this for a long time, like, if you start paying attention, like, how you feel during and after. Because I think a lot of times with exercise, it's really easy to be like, how do I feel during this? Or like, oh, I was able to do it, so that was fine. But see, like, how do you feel the rest of your day? Do you feel yourself dragging on this day when you wouldn't have, another day? So I think with the inversions, it's kind of like tuning into that, but remembering that the uterus is a muscle. And so if you're removing blood flow from that, that could also increase cramps and things like that, just from not having the optimal blood flow. And even like you need more water when you're in your period, like that hydration can also help with cramps. Because again, we think of it as so separate, but it's a muscle. If you're dehydrated, if it's not getting the blood flow, then it can cause more cramps.
Oh, that's interesting. So when you're like releasing the uterus walls, is the muscle then relaxing?
So it's basically contracting.
Okay.
And that's what actually is like releasing the lining and pushing it through.
Oh,
interesting.
Wow.
Like kind of like it is birth a little bit, like mini.
Yeah. And it should feel like a very mini version, like conceptually the same. But unfortunately, a lot of women experience it like they're in labor.
Yeah. Wow. That'd be so intense.
Another also problem with the Ashtanga yoga culture is that because we have these things that are like getting new belts in kung fu or karate, or you get little gold stars for getting new postures. And then some people get a certification or an authorization for really going above and beyond the call of duty. It tends to be to be vulnerable to ambition and trying to be very ambitious with a practice and get that gold star and get that next belt. And so people start to really strive in the practice. Say just they start looking to reduce weight, reduce food intake, practice harder, ignore symptoms of pain, ignore suffering, take ibuprofen. Some of us have taken muscle relaxants. And you do see a lot of people who look pretty malnourished, to put it lightly, dehydrated, and who are not having regular periods.
Yeah, often women will lose their period.
Yeah, that's so common in any elite kind of
professional
athletic
athlete, right?
Yeah, and they have what's it called? Like, it's like basically called like an female athlete syndrome, where they lose their periods, they have osteoporosis, like anorexia, like these sort of symptoms, and it's this trifecta. But yeah, it's really when it's like you're not supporting the body that you have. And it really is during these reproductive years that it's like there's a whole other process going on here. And when you do things like restrict food, especially the week before your period, your body treats it almost like a famine and is going to store fat. So like even those goals that you think that you're working towards, but it can get tricky because like the week after your period, your appetite's a little lower. So it feels easy to restrict or at least to lower that count, and you feel like leaner. You don't have that heaviness because when you're on your period, like your organs actually like expand a little bit. So that bloating, sometimes it's just like you have organs and they expand and contract, like this is just how bodies work. But when that goes down, like you feel lean, you feel so energetic, and it's easy to restrict. But then when you continue that practice, when your body's doing more work, then it goes into this, it's a really stressful on the body. And so it will store fat because, again, there's still this biological process that's like, if we're pregnant, like we have to keep another, living form alive. Yeah. And we can't do that if we're losing all of this excess fat. There's actually a book written by this woman, Dr. Stacy Stims, that is all about like elite athletes using their cycle and training with their cycle. And she's saying like the stats on this is like, for men, the body fat percentage is something like, 8 to 10% is really what these athletes are striving for. But that in healthy women, it's like 12 to 15.
Yeah.
And so, but like most of the training is still trying to get women at the same percentage as men, but their bodies just don't function well.
Right.
And then they have these problems. And it's such a bigger issue, like just as a health issue, because regular ovulation is so protective for the menopausal years in terms of preventing breast cancer, osteoporosis, dementia, heart disease, like all of these major things. These years of having regular and balanced hormones go a long way in protecting women.
Wow.
Yeah, fascinating.
That's my one of my yoga students in San Francisco, a gynecologist, Vicky Steiner. She told me that there was a strong relationship between body fat and starting your period and then getting pregnant. Like there was I might mess this up, but like say like you have to be at like 12% body fat to be able to start initiating a pregnancy, which is how you see northern Scandinavian countries or England. Girls are starting their periods earlier, whereas in sort of drier climates with less calorie intake or fat intake, they start their periods like say 16. In the same way with pregnancy, like you have to be at something like, and again, I'm probably getting this stat completely wrong, but like 22%, 20% to be able to achieve pregnancy. Does that jive with what you're
absolutely.
learning?
Yeah. For sure. And especially when you see that with like athletes, like when they drop down to these lower body weights, and you see it with Olympians and stuff, like a lot of gymnasts, while they're gymnasts, they're like itty bitty, tiny little girls. And then they stop being gymnasts, they reach, the end of their career there, and then they actually start to develop because there is this kind of this cap, like your body can't do this reproductive function if it doesn't have enough resources. To do it. And then similar with pregnancy, like lower weight can just be a struggle to actually have ovulation happening regularly, and also having enough length of time between ovulation and what would be a period for implantation to happen. Because a lot of times, like even if you are ovulating, if that's a short window, like under 10 days between ovulation and a period, there's not enough time for implantation to happen. So it can also interfere on that end as well.
Interesting.
Wow.
Before I got pregnant with my son Jediah, I was doing like the natural birth tracking period method for a long time, natural birth control for many years. And so I'm curious, like, what is the difference between period tracking and cycle syncing, which is more sort of what you're focused on?
Yeah, so tracking is really interested in understanding like length, frequency of periods, of the phases between, from your period to ovulation and then ovulation to your next period. And that is really can tell you a lot about your health and a lot about fertility, and gives you just this wealth of data and information about how well your body's functioning. And then where cycle syncing goes beyond that, it takes that information and then says, now, how can I bring this into my everyday life? How can I set up my work tasks to be the best fit? Or how do I adjust when it's not the best fit for the current energy level that I have and what's on my plate that day? And it's really just this, it's going from, okay, we'll just go along with this as normal and we'll treat every day the same, as understanding that these are different. And when you can shift to looking ahead, saying, what if I made this easier by scheduling my social events when I'm laid out on the couch, like not wanting to do anything, like I'm texting the people, I'm doing that like planning work. So then the week after my period, when I'm like, oh yeah, it'd be nice to go do things, it'd be nice to have this social interaction, it's already set up for you. And that works out mostly because in that window, like you don't care as much about planning. Like the details are not the focus. It's much of a big picture energy and focus. So you don't want to plan things. You don't want to be picking out restaurants, reading reviews. You just want it to be there.
Yeah.
Can we dig into that a little bit deeper? There's an interesting point here on Harmony's notes that I wanted to ask about. If you could dig into the 4 phases of a menstrual cycle, and you say this wonderful thing, there's superpowers. Can you talk?
Yeah.
Can you describe those superpowers for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 4 phases are menstrual phase, which is the 3 to 7 days that you're bleeding. Then the days from your period to ovulation is called follicular phase. Then there's ovulation, and then luteal phase is from ovulation to the next period. And what's happening is that each of these windows, your hormones are at different levels. So on your period, like I mentioned, those hormones are at their lowest, and connections between the 2 hemispheres or your brain are the strongest. So again, this is that like that in tune and intuition moment of, maybe down to details of like, what's going well right now, what feels good for me to do in this moment, how can I adjust what's on my plate today so that I can honor this energy and maybe slow my pace a little bit. But it can also go into like deeper things of like what's working well or not in my relationship. How do I feel about the trajectory that my business or my career is going? It's a really good time to ask those questions, because it's easy, like you mentioned, the week after to feel that higher energy and higher optimism and think that like, okay, well, I was just having like a bad couple days. It's fine. But so that the menstrual phase, that's the superpower, is like getting really in tune with what you really want and who you are as a person. And that can lead to what conversations and boundaries you might want to address later in the month. And then the week after the period, that follicular phase, that is, again, that high energy. And that's like big picture planning, brainstorming, looking to the future and kind of thinking about like, how could I do these things? So if you're thinking about a shift in your business, you know, it's like, what would be the steps that would need to happen for me to make that shift possible? Or if it's in a relationship, saying like, okay, how do I introduce these conversations or this idea of a boundary and start talking about it at a time when I'm less reactive, so I can not only speak more kind of clearly and less of an attack, but like lay out, you know, what your experience is, and also be open to hearing the other person's side without feeling like that's, you know, a personal attack on you as well. So you can negotiate those conversations in a more productive way. And then that ovulatory window, those are probably like what your mom mentioned as the 2 days that she felt good. That's when like estrogen's high, you get a little boost in testosterone. So like that's when you say that you're glowing, libido's high, energy's high, and you're most really collaborative. And that time you want to be the most social. It's great for creative problem solving. So that's really like, if you think about, you know, the productivity advice, that's like, do your hardest thing first thing in the morning. Like this is that magic window of like, do your hardest thing when you're ovulating, when you feel
Yeah.
Wow.
When you feel connected and creative and confident.
Exactly. Or like if you have a hard conversation, if you want to ask for a raise, if you want to like pitch yourself for something that feels really big and scary, that's the window to do it in.
I love
and
it.
it's like, it's short. So it's just kind of that like golden window, right? But even thinking, that's a great place I like to tell people to start, is like, what's one thing you want to do this month? And that you want to, you know, what's that hard thing that you want to do during this like mid-cycle point?
That's so good.
And then after ovulation, during luteal phase, this is when our focus gets a lot more detail oriented. Our serotonin drops a little bit, so we're less in that like optimistic window. So we start to notice more of our surroundings. And that can be such a great time for implementation, execution. So you created this plan of like how you're going to make the shift in your business, or how laying out the two sides of maybe a problem in a relationship. And now it's like, okay, what are we going to do about it? And we're going to actually fill in those gaps of what's necessary to get it done. So it can be a workhorse kind of phase where you can get a lot done. The other side of that phase is that that's when people also will experience PMS and those symptoms if they haven't supported themselves well throughout the month, because our stress response is higher. So our body actually releases more cortisol to the same triggers, which is where we can get into that reactivity can start there as well, where we're more sensitive to things that people say. And so being aware of that, and with movement and things like that, that restricting calories, exercise, those things are a form of stress on the body. So paying attention to how really activated you are. Because if you have like a really good practice for your nervous system, like these things may be fine to work into your practice at the same level, because it's just going to be that little blip. But when you don't have that practice and you're in chronic stress, anything you do one workout and like now you're even more activated. And so it's that practice of getting yourself, you know, more balanced. And food is a great way to do that. Again, your caloric needs go up. So keeping your blood sugar stable goes a long way in helping you keep your mood and everything stable during that time.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. I mean, before I really started a regular yoga practice, I definitely know my PMS was like so intense. All those premenstrual symptoms of like feeling super depressed and like, you know, crying and like, I mean, when I was a teenager, even like suicidal ideations, like it was like very, very intense time. And then luckily I found yoga when I was quite young. I was like 20. And so it started to kind of balance out, and then was able to sort of be a lot more balanced during my 20s and 30s. But definitely that fourth phase for me is like my intense cleaning phase.
That's how it often shows up, is like that closet that needs to be cleaned out, the junk drawer that's like, grab what you want or it's all going in the garbage.
Yeah, it's like that attention to detail. Like the thing that's annoying me the most is like,
gotta go.
I'm getting rid of it.
And that's where the magic comes, when you can communicate that, when you're aware that these things are coming and it is a pattern, you can then start communicating to the people who live in your home. Like, this week, we're going to start organizing some stuff. And you can have these conversations like around that mid-cycle point where you're like, let's get the buy-in, let's get the collaboration. This is what I need from you in order for this to be successful, versus like waking up that Saturday and being like, the baseboards are
what? No,
and of course everyone else are like, that's never happened ever. Like, why is this Saturday?
I gotta go mow. I'm doing other stuff. What?
Yeah, that's good. Pre-planning for the
during the pre-menstrual cycle for the
pre-period.
Well, that's where tracking comes, and then it works together. When you're tracking, then you start to see and looking at that like with your calendar as well, and you see where these things are falling, and you can see what's already on your calendar, what's fixed there, and saying like, okay, that's going to require more effort this day than it might at a different point in my cycle. So how am I going to then support myself? So what am I going to add in or take off to accommodate for that one thing that really needs to happen that week?
It's so interesting thinking about collaboration, because you're also thinking about collaboration between genders and trying to get buy-in within the house. And I think that's a super interesting phrase or phrasing, because I've intuitively, I feel like I've been managing my role as a stepfather to kind of assist Harmony in her role as a parent, and thinking about her energy level. Because when I entered the home, when Jediah was 5, there's still so much service happening from the mother to the child. And, she's going to be completely drained and wiped just all the time, and irritable and angry. And I, I felt like my role there was to kind of help transform Jediah into, a person who's going to assist and be of service to his mother, who's been in service to him for the last 5 years. Now, the next 5 years, we're going to learn how to be of assistance to your mother so that she isn't completely drained all the time. And so these things like, look, we're helping mommy out right now because she needs it. Okay. And we're cleaning because otherwise, your teenager years are going to be a real problem.
You're not going to survive.
And just to say, just to wrap this up with a bow, just to say that I feel like we can do a lot more work on helping men collaborate with these cycles as well.
Yeah.
And helping them understand, how they can be of service rather than, a petulant child. Grown.
Yeah, I really like to talk about these things in terms of mental load as well, because I think that's a common thing that, couples deal with, and women often carrying like the heavier end of that, especially when it comes to the home. And they don't know how they got in that cycle either. But this is super helpful to understand that, because if you think about this like high energy version of yourself after your period, that's like, I can do all the things. I'm good. I don't need any help. But then it comes around to this time where like, oh, my energy's lower. I do need more help. Also, I'm more aware of all the things that aren't in the place they belong in my home. And those are usually when those blow-ups happen of like, why doesn't anyone help? How do you not see? Right? Like the question of like, well, how can I help you? Can sometimes be so offensive, because it's like, how do you not see all the things that are not how they're supposed to be? But it's understanding that that's not the same process that's happening for your partner. And so understanding how to get that buy-in when you are higher energy, when you have the capacity, especially if you're talking about kids, you have the capacity to teach them how to do things, because that is not, it takes a level of patience to be like, we're going to do it. We're going to let it not be perfect. We're going to let it not be the way that I want it done.
Yes.
Then set everyone up for success. So then when you ask for help, when you're lower energy, you're not having to show people how to do it. You're not having to give them like a detailed list of here's exactly what you do, because that doesn't feel like support in that time. Because you're like, well, if I have to do it all mentally, I might as well do it myself.
That's right. Now I'm doing 2 jobs instead of 1.
Yeah.
As
And
you
so it's
know,
learning
with
that
3 children under the age of 6, you're like
they're 4 and
under the age of 4. Oh my God. Yeah. They're all tiny.
Good God.
Tiny children.
So we're definitely in a pressure cooker season of life where it's like all hands on deck. But
is your husband in tune with your cycles? Is he like on board with?
Yeah, no, he's super supportive. And he's even asked me, so I have an app that I really like and I encourage people to get, because you can push your cycle app calendar to your Google Calendar. So
cool.
it will put like across your Google Calendar, like menstrual phase, luteal phase. So you can see it on your calendar, which is super helpful. But he's like, can you share that calendar with me?
Oh, that's so good.
So I know. It does help, because sometimes, again, with the tiny little humans, you're like, it's hard to have those check-in moments sometimes. So him being aware. But that also brings up, I think, another thing that we talked about of like, if we just jump into the implementation and like how we do things, a lot of times what gets skipped over is the reframes that we need to do when thinking about our cycle and our bodies. Because a lot of times, and I've heard him say this and I've caught myself saying it, of like, oh, well, we'll do this during your good week. Or this is like, like a good week versus a bad week.
Excuse me, sir?
But for years, that's how I thought about it as well, because I had such this dramatic shift in my experience that it was like good weeks, bad weeks. Yeah. And when you do have symptoms, it can very much feel that way. But there is that sort of narrative of like, well, when you're, you know, happy, high energy, and more people pleasing, like that's a good week. And it feels like a good week for everyone. Like,
that's right. Everyone's like, yes, I like this version of you.
But then when that shifts and it's more about like creating space for yourself or your needs or negotiating that process. So there's a lot of layers, and that's really what comes up in coaching is like, I mean, I can give you in a session, I can give you a blueprint of when to do which workout, when to eat which food. Like we can do that really quick. Yeah. But when you actually get to the day where you have to put in PTO for that one day on your period where you know that you need a break, like what is all the process to get you to actually put in that request? Or what do you do, like thinking ahead to what do you ask of your partner? What do you feel comfortable asking of your kids? And that's where the real work kind of happens.
Yeah, because it's hard to let go of doing it all, and it's hard to ask for help, and it's hard to plan ahead to ask for help at certain times, and like what things do you need to do versus what things can you let other people do. Those are all challenging sort of distinctions to make sometimes. Yeah. I can see that. And then what ends up happening is you have those blow-ups, like, you know, in the moment. And so, you know, how can you plan ahead to...
I think like 2 weeks ago, I literally said out loud, would you listen to yourself? You've been shitting on me for 30 straight minutes about every last thing I'm doing. I think that's a quote.
Probably.
Going to see that on your Instagram next week.
That's right.
From the episode.
That's right.
Yeah, no, that I can see that being really important, and like learning how to take that personal time for yourself, right? And make those requests. And
I think there's a lot of pressure to be present, especially like in motherhood. Like you have to be there. You have to be doing all the things, and starting to get some perspective on that quality versus quantity. Because one, it's like in the moment, like if you're reactive and not able to enjoy that moment and be really present, then is this really doing your kid this service, or are you just here to be here? And then also like that long-term perspective as well, because it's also about sustaining and not burning out where you're like, I need a whole weekend off, which may not be practical. You might not have the help or the finances or whatever to actually do like, I'm doing a weekend away alone. And so it's like, how do you build this in so that you don't reach those points of like, I'm now at a 10 and anything else that happens, like I'm blowing up, and it comes as a shock to everyone else, because a lot of these things are happening internally and we're not communicating them, or when we do, it's in a way that doesn't allow people to see this as you being vulnerable and sharing like a need. It comes off as angry. And then it creates those defense mechanisms, right? Where it's like, no one wants to be yelled at for any length of time.
That's true.
Or to feel like everything they're doing is wrong, when they're obviously trying to make an effort as well. And so that self-awareness, is so important for yourself, and then also how you communicate that and model that for your family and for your kids, for them to see that that's also normal for someone not to be the same every day and show up the same every way, but that connection can still be equally as strong.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question. I feel I have this value that I cherish, which is a healthy respect for female rage. And growing up with my mom, who is a famously violent temper, and I've seen grown-ass big men hide from her. I've seen shopkeepers hide in a closet to get away from her. Obviously, there's some hormonal imbalances there. But it's, I feel like we should also respect and not dismiss moments of rage as
hormonal,
evil.
Evil
or wrong. Like should be like if you're blowing up, fair point. You're blowing up. I'm going to just take it, pardon the phrase, take it like a man. And so I felt like I couldn't be in a marriage with someone who, if I didn't also feel like they couldn't take an axe and fucking kill me with it. Like I just wouldn't, it doesn't work for me. And I had to get out of a marriage because of that. So I'm very comfortable in the marriage I'm in now because I have a healthy respect for Harmony's violent side that I know is just simmering there. And then I feel like I can respect a person who has that in them. Thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I agree that there's power and value in that ability, the almost like mama bear energy, or the like, I'm not putting up with anyone's BS. I think that's such a powerful thing. And by that, I also mean that it's like, it can be wielded in ways that do a lot of damage.
That's true.
And it can also be used really productively. And so that's where the self-awareness comes in. Because I think if you're seeing like, this is a pattern that has, thinking about, we'll use mental load as an example. Like if these are things you've asked for and you've been clear about at various points, you've given, lots of chances for someone to actually get on board. And it's not happening. Then you can like use these times and know that like when I'm in this menstrual phase, when I'm in this point where like, I'm going to be very direct about what my needs are, I may be able to add like the weight and importance of this conversation that I can't communicate as well at another time of the month. So I think that people should know that they can use that, especially for things that are reoccurring or something that's hard. If you're trying to end a relationship and it needs to end, but you haven't quite been able to get yourself to do that, knowing that this is the time where you're going to have like the fortitude to be like, no, I'm not putting up with this. And I'm actually going to walk out the door. I'm actually going to take the action. So I think understanding, it's just that awareness to understand the power of it, because there's also people in your life who are 100% for you and love you and like want to support you. And so if those are coming out at them and used towards them in ways that aren't actually like moving the relationship forward or creating connection and doing those things, like that can also be problematic. And so it really comes back to that, the self-awareness piece first, so that is this an issue of like, I haven't asked for what I've needed, and so I'm blowing up because really what I need to do is go take a nap, or I need to go take 5 minutes to breathe and get away from this current situation for a moment? Or is this repetitive reoccurring pattern in our relationship that needs that like heavier strength and weight to it?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Because in that window, those things will probably all feel the same.
Right.
So, like it feels equally problematic, but that doesn't mean they all require that level of, kind of force and power in communicating it.
Yeah, totally. I have another interesting question that I'd love to get your take on. So a lot of times I've had a lot of students in the past that have endometriosis. And so they're having like really painful periods that last for a long, long time. And it really interferes with their physical practice because, well, first of all, there's this tradition of resting during your menstrual cycle. So then they can't really practice for a couple of weeks. Or if they do practice, they have even more pain sometimes. How should women deal with like endometriosis? Is there like a way that can, or things they can do to make it better outside of drinking more water? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing with endometriosis is it's slightly different because it is exacerbated by the normal like hormone fluctuations, but the root causes, newer research is showing that it's more of a like autoimmune disease is also related to the gut and all of these other things. So that the hormone cycle is like related and can make it, the experience of it worse, but they're not really tied to the same thing. So it's different from, it's not just like this is more extreme cramps than someone else. Like this is actually like an autoimmune disorder that's happening. So the root cause, approaches are slightly different there. But generally speaking, like having balanced hormones is going to help you with that, because really the issue here is having estrogen dominance because it modulates our immune system. And so if it's out of balance, it can contribute to these autoimmune responses. So having the practices of, with diet, one thing that you can do is prioritize more raw foods around that ovulation portion of the month to help flush out extra estrogen. So higher fiber, greens, vegetables, smoothies, salads, those sorts of things can help
flush out extra estrogen.
Yeah. So your body produces estrogen and then it also then processes it through like your liver, through your gut, and you pass estrogen through bowel movements and everything as well. So your body has to get rid of excess estrogen. Because if it doesn't release it, it will recycle back into the body. And then you can have estrogen levels that are too high. And so it's great until it's not. And when it's not, then you can get like breast tenderness around ovulation. You can get that like mid-cycle cramping. You can have those symptoms that you shouldn't expect around ovulation when estrogen is too high. And then when it's too high, your progesterone levels that should be peaking in luteal phase, they may not reach that like optimal balance. So then you can experience the like symptoms that look like low progesterone as well, because it's this ratio of estrogen and progesterone. And then you add in stress to the picture, which movement can be that then, because stress is also a hormone like cortisol, adrenaline, and the same nutrients and building blocks that create stress hormones like cortisol also are what are used to produce progesterone and estrogen. So if you have all of these resources going to cortisol, because obviously your body's priority is stay alive, it's not going to worry about feeling good. And so it's keeping those things in balance so that you're alive and thriving is ideal. So then with endometriosis, it's really that thing of like learning for it to be okay to do what feels good for your body. And a lot of it is adjusting the goalposts. Because when you're dealing with, if you even talk about it as an autoimmune disorder, like the way and the language that we use around these sorts of disorders and, malfunctions, so to speak, are different than how we talk about menstrual health issues. Because this is just like a female problem, whatever, versus like something that's maybe has a little bit more clout as a real thing. And even mentally to give yourself permission that like, no, this is a real thing and it sucks. Like there's not, that's, it's not to say that this isn't hard in any way, but that adjusting those expectations on yourself and listening to what works for your body is going to do the most. And taking the time off actually helps your progress. And it can feel like it doesn't, but pushing through those times doesn't actually get you the gains that you're looking for. It shows up in other ways.
It's the opposite.
Yeah. I love though too that like your emphasis on how personal it is, right? That it's like
Mhm.
really learning to tune in and like listen to what your body really needs and pay attention to like, you know, feeding it when it needs to be fed and resting when it needs to rest and moving when it needs to move. And the type of movement might change depending on what phase of the cycle you're in. And I think that's really important that it's not like a rule book, like, okay, do this for phase one, do this for phase two, like that it is going to be unique based on every woman's experience because our hormones are different and we react differently to our
Yeah.
hormones too, right?
Everyone's sensitivity level is different. And I find the framework of cycle syncing really beneficial because like I like to have a system. So it's
Yeah.
nice for me to like set it up like I do these meals this week, I do this workout this week and set it up that way. But it's really like this is something that should serve you. And there's so much in our culture that's like put these benchmarks, right? Like you're losing a certain amount of weight or you're getting a six pack or you're able to do, you know, a certain position for a certain amount of time. And like that's the goal. But when you shift the goal to, I want to be strong, flexible, and feel good in my body, like when it's really about how do I feel in my body, then no, taking 2 or 3 rest days has no impact.
Right.
Because you're still doing what's most productive towards that goal for you that day.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, reframing that doing more isn't always going to help you more, right? Sometimes doing less is going to help you more in the long run. Often
when
doing
it comes
less
to
helps
hormone
more.
imbalances, like that rest is what's going to help your body to heal, get more regular, become more balanced. So then, and that's the goal. The goal is not to restrict and rest all the time, but to get yourself in a place where you have more of your days where it is like a blip on your radar. And part of that comes with the practice of like the first couple months, it might feel like, okay, this is so new. I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. But it really quickly becomes like, oh, this is about being. And what's difficult is learning to be and allow how I feel today to be okay. And that I'm going to feel different next week is also okay. That's where it becomes easy.
Mm-hmm.
You stop fighting.
I would say that's endemic of the entire North American culture is learning how to be is extraordinarily difficult. And you see that in the, you know, in the children who struggle to do anything if they're not entertained. Whereas you can, you know, if you go to other countries and you see children who are, you know, not being entertained, just sitting there and dealing with that in a, you know, much more positive way.
Yeah, we don't have practices of quiet and mindfulness and all of those things built in to our society. And so then we don't feel comfortable, which you know probably more than I do. You don't feel comfortable in that space. And so that's like where that work is of learning to be comfortable with like, I'm not doing all the things today, but that doesn't mean that I can't or that there's something wrong with me. And that's where that kind of performance mentality comes in as well. Is like your cycle doesn't really affect outcome performance. You can do, you know, barring things like endometriosis or some of these more, you know, debilitating kind of experiences where there's something wrong with how things are functioning. But like overall, it's not that you can't do the things. You can run a marathon. You can, you know, obviously with training, not just like I'm going to go out. I could not run a marathon today. But it's like those performance-based things, you can do that. But it's really about how are you going to support yourself before, after, in the week coming, because you can't run a marathon every single day.
Right.
Like that's going to be too much for your body. So getting in that mentality of what on my calendar or in my goals with my yoga practice or, and, you know, in life, what's that goal of like, I'm going to achieve this. And then how am I going to do that in a sustainable way where like I get there and I feel good in the process, or I get there and I can enjoy it when I arrive and not, you know, just move that goalpost or, you know, just be so burnt out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I think it's an important thing to take into account because especially, I mean, as women, Sorry, Russell. But, I think because we do tend to juggle more things, we're more like multitasking all the time. Like, okay, the kids have this and they have this schedule. And then like maybe you have your partner's schedule or what's going on with them. And then you have like your own schedule and what's going on with you. And maybe you're like building a business on the side and you're trying to fit in your self-care and your workout routine. And you gotta, make the dentist appointments and the vet appointments and the, all the things, right? And that tends to be, for the most part, the sphere of like running a home and a business and like doing all the things and keeping track of all the people and beings and animals and life in your sphere. And so, I think it's really important what you're saying is that, trying to tap into that natural cycle of like, when is the good time to be like, okay, I'm in a phase right now where I can really like get through these emails and make these appointments and do all the scheduling. And now I don't have to think about that for a couple of weeks, you know, and I can just like move into like this other space, which is more focused on like the being and like being present with people. And, because it's a lot to balance every day if you're trying to balance all the different tasks and demands and responsibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of thinking about it like there's seasons for these different tasks. Because when you're trying to find consistency and balance day to day, we feel crazy because we're like, well, last week I blocked out, 2 hours to do this task. And now I'm sitting here and it's like, going on hour 4 and I still feel like I'm struggling to do what I set out to do. And that's just this lack of awareness of what feels easy at different times. And so if we can schedule those and like you're saying, like all the appointments, you sit down like the week to week and a half before your period, schedule everything, call all the doctors, like get it on the calendar. And then, that may pop up later on a time of the month that's not great for you because obviously doctor's appointments are the worst. You can never, it's like, okay, how does 6 months from now work? And you're like, exactly. I'll take it. Like, sure. It's like, there's all these things that's like, you don't have control over that. But when it's on your calendar and like, okay, this is all the appointments ended up in this 1 week, that's going to be rough. So how do we adjust our expectations in other areas to accommodate that? But it really is just trying to set you up where more of the time your energy matches what you have on your schedule and what your expectations for yourself are that day. Because I think that's the biggest kind of disparity between men and women is like men know what to expect. They wake up, unless something crazy happens, they go out drinking or, something disrupts their normal pattern. They know exactly how they're going to feel.
Yeah.
And there's individual difference in that. Some people are higher energy and they like hit the ground running. Some people need a slower morning, but like every single day they know like I need this window to this window.
Yeah.
And we want that and we crave that, but we think that it should look that same way. We're like, I should know how I'm waking up tomorrow. And you can, but it's not necessarily going to be how you woke up yesterday. And so once you can kind of fill those pieces in, it's like, oh, okay, like I know what to expect. I know what to ask of other people. I know what to ask of myself. I know how to support myself. And that just changes the game.
Yeah. And adjusting your expectations, like you're saying, that it's not going to be the same every single day. And that's okay.
And that's normal. Like that's what it's supposed to be. Because that's where I felt stuck for so long as I was striving either for neutral. Like I'm just like, I didn't want to get too high of highs because like the lows are terrible, so I'm like trying to strive for neutral or I'm going to be the same every single day. That's the goal. And that's not a sustainable goal.
Right. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm thinking also about the way that we interact with each other and the way that we relate to each other. I think, Harmony, you told me once that men will develop higher estrogen cycles when they have children and when they're around babies. I think you told me that once. Is that true? Did I mishear that?
I think so. And as they age too, men's estrogen levels go up.
That's so interesting because they would be more social with the child, which would be positive for to prevent our species from going extinct. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
and I think some of it is the slightly lower testosterone is also like leans more to keeping the family unit together as well.
Yeah. I think I was remember uh, I've been reading a lot of Robert Sapolsky's work on hormonal cycles in mammals, and one of the things about estrogen is that it kind of creates stronger ties, but those those circles also mean that anyone outside the circle is a little bit more alien as well, more of a threat. Looking at testosterone levels as being more about uh, performance and perfectionism than and that was a very interesting way of thinking about testosterone. It's like more higher testosterone leads to more perfectionism. But I was also just thinking about what happens like when you suddenly find yourself in a home. You get married and you move in with somebody, and it's like suddenly like that person's affecting your hormone cycle. You of course, I think it's broadly understood that women cycle their hormones together when they live together, and I think I'm interested to know like how suddenly having a man in your house affects your cycle of your hormones as well, and like what women can anticipate when they suddenly have some kind of hairy beast in their house that they kind of have to
negotiate.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. So first, that's pretty much a myth that women cycle together, like based on their hormones.
It's a myth?
It's very common for people who are like in the same place or, similar like lifestyle and place to be on the same cycle, but it's not I'm responding to your hormone pattern.
Oh.
And the research that's on it is just, there's some studies that are like, yeah, there's kind of a link, but they never quite lined up. Like, why is it certain relationships? Like they'd be like stronger tie relationships but those things don't really hold up. And another study that I think points to is they never found any times where ovulation was matching up to each other.
Oh, interesting.
Which is a much more, would be a much more kind of stable vector in that. But also, if you think about, we all have similar range of cycles, and then you have some of the population that's very regular, some that are irregular. So like it would have to be an over like 50% chance. Or the studies would have to prove that this is like over 50% likely due to your hormones for it to not just be by chance. Like, we're all on like the same number of days. So, and then you add in like when you live together, you're probably eating similar foods, you're keeping a similar schedule. So it's likely that you'll end up on there. There's more study to show that we cycle in relation to the moon than we do with each other's like hormone patterons.
Interesting.
But I've heard, so many people say that, or they're like, oh yeah, we synced up with the person who was on the pill. That definitely didn't happen. And that doesn't make sense.
No.
Wow.
That's interesting. I love that syncing with the moon, and we always call it like you're on your ladies' moon days when you're having your period. But also there's this idea that like at the full moon is sort of the ovulation time and the new moon is more the menstrual time. Is that what the studies have also kind of shown?
Yeah, and basically what they've shown is they see some connection with it, and like things like whales, like aquatic mammals, cycle with the moon as well.
Amazing.
But a lot of it is like in our modern world, they don't see as much of a connection because of all the artificial lights and like our daily practice isn't as in tune to nature. But women who live in more rural areas spend more time like in the natural, like moonlight. Their bodies do tend to regulate based on that. And so that's, again, related to your circadian rhythms as well. And just getting your cycle to be regular, because the moon phases are happening at about, 28 days. So the more regular you are, the more likely that it's going to line up to those.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And obviously, I think the male-female hormones, like there is more kind of studies on like pheromones and like just more attuned, but those studies are usually typically more in like the sexual attraction kind of component of like you can kind of tell when someone's ovulating, right? Like they're glowing, they're more inviting, I don't know, whatever you want to say.
I've heard even like more decorated.
More decorated.
Yeah.
Well, I've heard, so one thing that I've heard is like women, there was one study that was saying that women tend to purchase sexier clothing when they're online shopping, when they're ovulating, like just like, it affects your behavior.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
My aunt had such a very interesting experience. She was from Australia and she moved here to Canada and married my uncle. This was like a long time ago, obviously. And she couldn't get pregnant at all while she was in Canada, and they adopted a couple of children, and then they all moved back to Australia. And as soon as she was in Australia, she got pregnant twice. I mean, there's a lot going on there, adopting and all the things.
Much more
women who adopt get pregnant, but it is interesting. These sort of like what you're saying, our body, our hormones, our psyche, they're all connected to like what we're feeling internally at a very unconscious level.
Yeah. And that's why, they kind of point to the menstrual cycle as, this vital sign. It's like really this window. Like if you start seeing that you're becoming more regular, your cycle length is changing significantly, because like a couple days here or there every month is still within normal. But when you start to notice those things or increase in symptoms, it points to bigger issues, either in your lifestyle or, kind of deeper internally as well.
What about with like perimenopause and stuff, when your cycle is actually kind of all over the place and your hormones are a little bit all over the place as well? Things are really changing. How can women navigate through that chaos?
Yeah. And I think, again, this is a time where like a lot of it is reframing your perspective on what it is, because even the concept of hormones being all over the place is more of like what we're told about it, because what's happening is it's essentially like a reverse puberty. So if you think about when you're starting your cycle and your hormones can feel a little bit more erratic because they're working themselves up to like adult level, balance, right? So when you look at the graphs of how this works, like during puberty, it's almost like this staircase as the hormones are like kind of going up and then a little down, and they're working their way up to a more stable level. And then when you start entering into perimenopause, it's a similar process. It's just this like downward staircase of your hormones deregulating, in a sense, like de-escalating. But during that window, what's still happening is your body is still trying to ovulate every month. That's like the key, all of this centers around ovulation. And so as it's going through that process, some months that won't happen. And so that's when you see like, okay, you might still have all of these emotional fluctuations because your hormones are trying to do this process. Right. But if they don't quite hit these thresholds, then you won't ovulate. And then that's when you get that longer stretch between periods. And it's really this like just withdrawal bleed from like, your hormones eventually dropping off and essentially giving up on that round. So it can feel crazy, or it can feel like, in 1 month, you might feel yourself like trying to ovulate a couple times, like emotionally, where your hormones are going up and then they dip and they go up and dip. So it can lead to that feeling of discomfort or feeling all over the place, and a higher sensitivity to it. Because I've also talked to women who are entering that age window and they're like, this was never a thing. Like my period was always kind of mild, but now there's this sort of heightened sensitivity because the goal is for them to lower down to once you hit menopause, and it's almost back to, it like looks almost the same as childhood levels.
Yeah. Wow.
Which is one of my favorite kind of descriptions of menopause, is that it's like a return to girlhood, because it's this window where you, with the lower estrogen levels, and it's a different type of estrogen at that point, like you no longer feel this need to be like so in a people pleasing, like outward focus. So you get to return to like, who am I? What do I want to do? And you care less if that doesn't fit with other people's plans, which is just such a freeing, it's such a freeing thing, which is nice to look forward to.
Yeah, totally.
On the other side.
I hear that from women in my mom's kind of community all the time. Like, I'm just going to do what I want to do, and I just don't give a shit anymore. It's such a common phrase, and I think throughout history, women of a certain age have said that sort of thing, and it's so interesting to think about it.
Then they got burned at the stake.
Not
how
not
societies
atypical.
respond to that has varied from different cultures.
Sure,
there are
sure.
some cultures who honored it a lot, like the grandmothers were like such a vital part of the community because they were now not taking care of other people, so they would like, we will go on long walks and we'll pick berries and we'll bring back food and we'll, just live their best lives. But it does support the community. And then obviously, there's been points in history where that's been not accepted at all.
Well, in these suburban communities that I'm referring to, you just basically get the fuck out of their way, and just. I think that's a kind of honoring.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, that comes a big shock to men who are now like their testosterone levels are lowering. They're becoming more, wanting
Social,
that connection maybe a little more, and then
mellowing,
like, wait a second,
as we used to say in the 50s. Yeah,
yeah,
it's like a reverse role.
Your wives are like, whatever, do what you want.
Yeah.
See ya.
Awesome.
It's so funny. Harmony and I have very kind of similar parents. We both have dads who don't talk and just sit there and have done it. And we're like so comfortable with being, and then highly neurotic mothers. And you kind of, it's interesting to watch that kind of just transition to more social dads and more moms are just going to do what they want to do.
Yeah. And so I think how cycle syncing, in that process, what it can really be helpful in is learning that practice of, taking stock and taking time to see what really matters to you, especially in that perimenopausal window, as you're transitioning to this level of freedom, because it's such a huge identity shift when for so long your identity has been centered around whether it's your kids or maybe it's your career, these these parts of your identity. And then it's now oh, maybe I don't care about those things anymore or at the same level, or I'm not needed in the same way. And it can be a really good time to use the practices of, when your cycle is stretched out longer, you may not necessarily be able to plan ahead for that, but you can definitely take stock and adjust your expectations and have grace with yourself in the process. And you can also lean into what are things that I really care about, so you can start communicating those as you lead into that window. Because obviously that's a big shock if you've been doing, especially if you think about these older generations where wives did so much in the home and taking care of everyone. And then they wake up one day and are like, you're on your own. I'm not cooking you breakfast anymore. I'm out, and that can create these rifts, because that's usually right where that divorce rate happens is when kids go to college and then the empty nester, that empty nester window, because it's oh, we're not the same people, and you really aren't the same people anymore. And so being the more self-aware, and it's really cycle syncing is this framework to be self-aware and notice these changes. And then you can again be collaborative and bring people in the process so that it's something that's now who do we want to be, in this new phase where I'm not being pulled in so many directions versus arriving and being no, we're not on the same page at all of what our future looks like.
And I feel like this is another opportunity to positively reframe codependency.
To collaboration.
We can just, we can't do anything apart. We're both in our different, hormonal stages of life, but we're not comfortable being away from each other. So we can just stay married. That's all right.
No, it really is. It's this practice of learning, what do you need as an individual and what do we actually need together? And that's going to vary by couple too, as you get into these different phases of life of what do we need to still ground us as a couple versus what we need on our own to do and to be. And it can be a really cool time to just explore, and it's so much of the language around it is the end, right? Oh, now you're dried up and you're, whatever, it's over. But you can have the same, if not more years in menopause than in your reproductive cycle.
Right.
So you have, this is a whole new perspective on life. And so that can be a really, really cool time and a really powerful time to do all the things, that you've dreamed of or new dreams. So again, yeah, the reframe is so powerful in the process.
Do you think that during that like perimenopause or menopausal years, it's still helpful to like take some rest during like with the moon phase or something? Do you think it's helpful to like incorporate sort of cycles even if you're not cycling in the same way?
During perimenopause, I would say definitely. And that may shift some, like as you get closer to menopause, where you're like, okay, I maybe have a cycle once every 6 months. And so you may not feel those changes. But I think even being aware of how your moods are changing, even if it's not like textbook, 28-day cycle, you can still get a lot out of it as a practice and like learning to be mindful. And part of what's happening is you also just get like these heightened sensitivities. So like being aware of what's affecting you, like alcohol, it's going to affect you a lot more. Caffeine affects you a lot more, and it affects your sleep because like melatonin production drops a little bit. So that's why like insomnia can become a common symptom in perimenopause, especially when like no lifestyle changes are made at the same time. And so it's this like window that you really being in tune with like what your body needs and adjusting is really powerful. And then what I've heard from a few different women who are in like actually on the other side of it in menopause are like, oh, I still feel these emotional dips.
Interesting.
So that may not be like the whole, the rest of your life, but in even the few years after you've like hit the menopause mark, your body may still be doing some of these like fluctuations. So you might still, at least on the emotional side of it, may be helpful just to have that awareness and not necessarily cycle with it, but again, with setting your expectations and knowing what you need when those shifts happen. But then during menopause, like that's a time when you can shift back to almost like a circadian rhythm pattern. So you can still be honoring your hormones and what's a natural rhythm for you, but it does shift more to that circadian rhythm at that point.
Nice. Amazing. This has been so fascinating and so interesting. Who knew we could talk about menstruation for an hour and a half?
I didn't think so.
Tell everyone where, if they want to learn more, if they want to come to you, they're interested in like developing some habits for better coping skills, time management, planning, all of the things that you're going to help people work on aligning with their cycles. Where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at Briana Villegas Coaching. That's the best place to connect with me. I also have a podcast called Hormone Rants.
Amazing.
Hormone Rants.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds like my mom.
Yeah. So I thought it'd be a nice sort of play on, this very like idea we have of being hormonal, but also reframe that to, it's very much like education based of like, these are things that no one's ever told you and you should have known from the beginning.
I love it.
So that's another way to learn more about what I do.
Cool. Well, we're going to link it in the show notes, Hormone Rants, and at Briana Villegas. On Instagram.
Yeah.
And people can just reach out to you and I'm sure get a free consult or a paid consult or something.
Yeah. And I'm opening up like launching my 3-month coaching program soon. So you can definitely get on a call and learn more about what that actually means. I think that's the biggest question. It's like, but what do we do?
What do we do? Yes, always, right?
I'm happy to answer those questions.
You're like, we're going to change your life.
Exactly.
Good. Well, thank you so much for coming on our show today.
That
it was
awesome.
So great and a topic that is near and dear to every Ashtanga yoga woman practitioner's heart, I'm sure.
Oh, good.
That was incredibly stimulating, and thank you so much for sharing. And
I think even the men got something out of it.
Even the men. And I just want to say thank you for coming and sharing with us.
Oh, of course. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely.